So it started with the Catholics, and then it went to include Jews and Muslims and other believers. Today, we have a lot of non-believers, atheists and agnostics, who are also out there saying this baseline that you're assuming about religious belief or the values of our country are not actually what we believe or maybe what we ever believed. And so there's tension that comes from the recognition of more and more diverse voices. And then certainly in the context of racial justice and questions about race and ethnicity, when there are groups of people who have been legally or culturally silenced for a long time who start to speak up, then there's also pressure on an assumed consensus or a sense of what even civic peace looks like. And I think for a lot of people, I mean, even thinking back to this summer, and it's not like these issues are new in any sense. We've been having them and struggling with them for a long time in this country. But the more that we pause and listen to voices, the more that we invite voices into the conversation and to speak, then the more honesty we're going to hear. And I think one of the real challenges to discovering the depths of our differences is that sometimes they have to be iterative through a series of conversations, because in the first instance with someone who disagrees with you, you might not actually get the full and unvarnished truth about the depths of your disagreements. They might still be trying to feel you out and figure out, can I trust you to talk about the real vulnerabilities that I feel around race or gender or whatever else it is. And it's only after a series and layers of depth to conversation that you realize how deep the divides are and how much work there is to even understand them.
Yeah. What does it take to build that trust? Like, what does that look like to get past kind of those initial, the initial walls that might be up, or the initial, like, I'm not really going to let you into what I really think about this?
Yeah. So I think not social media is probably the first advice I have there. But the other, I mean, I think the recognition that this is not going to work with everyone. So our goal as Christians or people, even citizens who want to engage across difference, this doesn't mean go find your first acquaintance who differs from you along some contested norm or issue and start to have a deep conversation. You have to sort of work to find the trusted relationships that are going to allow this to happen. And then building that trust means starting with the very ordinary things of life. A lot harder to do in a pandemic, but in a non-pandemic, at least, sharing meals together, or maybe if it has to be this way, over Zoom, just learning about each other's lives a little bit and waiting to ask those really hard questions until there's a foundation that's been laid about a friendship. And then in a more natural and organic way, pressing into that friendship a little more. I think there's a kind of culture around American Christianity today that is very checklist oriented. You just want to buy the book that gives you the checklist on how to solve the problem. But faith and friendship and witness just really aren't susceptible to checklists. They just have to be embodied in relationships that are hard and messy and unpredictable. And so I think for Christians especially, to move out of that checklist mentality and think up front, what is this going to risk me? How much uncomfortability and how much uncertainty am I going to allow? And am I doing this in a way that fully invites the other person into a conversation with me? Or am I just trying to prove a point or check a box?
Yeah, which is that can be a scary thing, to allow that kind of uncertainty and to enter into that kind of a mess with people. But that does seem to be where it really happens, like where we're really able to do this kind of work. Well, maybe stepping back a little bit from that, you talk about pluralism. You describe, one of the ways that you describe that is our manyness, out of the many. You can say this better than I can, but why is pluralism worth preserving? That's an assumption that you're obviously working with, is that pluralism is worth preserving, and it's not just a matter of saying one way is the right way and we need to die on that hill. Why is that worth preserving, and how can we as Christians think about that, given that our faith makes some exclusive claims, and there we might have differing understandings from our neighbors of what flourishing looks like. So why is that worth preserving, and how do we make sense of that as Christians?
Yeah, so maybe to start off, let's think of pluralism in two different ways. One being the fact of difference in the world, and then two being the political response to that fact of difference in the world. So let's start with the first one, pluralism as the fact of difference in the world, and not only just trivial differences, but deep and irreconcilable differences. So Christians, and we can root this even in Trinitarian theology, can say a lot of difference in the world is really a good thing. It's beautiful to see difference in God's creation. And then Christians can also say, not all difference is just factually good. So I have a friend of mine who's an atheist philosopher, and we sometimes get into these discussions, and he'll say, you know, John, it's just great that we disagree about so many things. You like mint chocolate chip ice cream, and I like vanilla, and you like the Cardinals, and I like the White Sox, and you believe in God and I don't believe in God. And I usually, when we get to that point of the conversation, I say, actually, no, it's not a good thing that you don't believe in God. In fact, it breaks my heart that you don't believe in God. And in, you know, the world that I would like to see, that wouldn't be the case. So Christians cannot affirm that all difference is good. Some difference is good. Some of it's kind of trivial, like ice cream flavors. Some difference is less trivial, but still okay. And some difference, Christians would say, is not good, but it's a fact of the world, right? There are people in this country, in this city, who don't believe in God. There are people who have very different moral beliefs than we do. And so as the fact of pluralism, it's incumbent on Christians to recognize that as a fact of the world. And then the second question is, so what do we do about that fact of the world? And we could either run away from it, as some Christians want to do. That strikes me as not a great gospel response to difference and uncertainty. We could try to control it or suppress it, as Christians through the ages have done, and that has seldom, if ever, worked out well. Yeah. Or we could try to live with it and work toward friendship and persuasion. And so in that sense of pluralism, the political response that says we have to engage with this difference, and we have to, as much as we can, persuade and resist coercion and manipulation. That seems to me to be theologically the way that we invite people into a relationship with Jesus Christ, that we witness as a community to those around us. And then it also reminds us that as much as we are banking our lives and are confident in the claims we make, we also recognize that Christians have been very wrong about some things through the ages. And so there's a kind of humility that says, it's usually not a great idea to be non-pluralistic in our politics, to control, to aim for a kind of theocracy that forces people into our beliefs, to legislate our own views or our own morality. That when Christians have done that through the ages, they've sometimes been very, very wrong, and people have suffered tremendously. So as we look back on not only the witness of the church, but also the broken frailty of the church, and to say that the gifts and the resources we've been given to be people who are present and loving and serving and persuading, that is the way that we engage with difference, not either cowering in fear or withdrawal or trying to control or overcome.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's helpful, that you talk a lot about tolerance and humility, and we'll unpack those a little bit more as we continue the conversation. But I think that those are helpful definitions of the fact of difference in the world, and thinking about how we can look at that. With that, tell us a little bit about in your chapter in Uncommon Ground, you talk about the vocation of translation. In what ways tell us a little bit about that, and what ways we might find ourselves in that vocation of translation as we pursue relationships with folks who are different from us, our neighbors, our coworkers, our family members, even folks within our church community. What does that look like, and how does our Christian faith inform that work of translation?
Yeah, let me answer that question. Let me back into that answer by describing a little bit of what I'm doing in Uncommon Ground. Mm-hmm. I think you rightly mentioned that the first book, Confident Pluralism, I wrote it really for any American of any faith or no faith to engage in the arguments. You have to sort of believe in American history and law and political theory. And the argument or the persuasiveness of that book is going to rest or fall on the extent to which I've made a persuasive account from American history and politics, and then also whether there are better accounts of alternatives out there. But as I was writing that book, from the very beginning, I was thinking the arguments I'm making, even though they're written for a general audience, not necessarily a Christian one, are fully compatible with Christian theology and the way that I think we're called to live in the world. And so over time, I started a kind of a process of reverse translation of confident pluralism into more of a specifically Christian dialect or arguments. And along the way, partner with Tim Keller to do this book that is essentially, I mean, he would say it's confident pluralism for Christians. And we're together trying to deploy this argument within a gospel frame. And then we decided, rather than just write a book-length treatment, that we would invite friends of ours to come and write autobiographical chapters about how they navigate in this world of difference in their own vocational lanes, and how through the power of narrative stories, what it means to demonstrate this kind of engagement. And then as the book's editor, I was able to give myself whatever chapter I wanted. So I assigned myself the chapter of the translator, because I thought it represented well what I am vocationally called to do. And so I talk about really two parts of my life. One, when I was a practicing lawyer, I saw my goal as a lawyer to take very difficult to penetrate concepts from my clients, who were extremely smart people. Some of them, I worked for the government and had a lot of witnesses who were engineers, some of them literally rocket scientists, and they were brilliant, but they couldn't necessarily always explain why their brilliant rocket science mattered to this case, or how someone who was less ingrained in their craft could understand it. And so my job as the lawyer was to take their complicated idea and to understand it as well as I could, and to unpack it into very simplistic terms so that the decision makers could understand what was going on and why it was important. And so my task there was twofold. One, I really had to understand the object of my translation. I had to get that satellite right. And if I didn't, I would be not doing my job. But I also had to know the audience to whom I was translating. I needed to know what their language was, what priors and premises they brought to the conversation, so that I could talk about satellites at the level that they needed to hear. And then I do a very similar thing, I think, in classroom teaching. So I have a deep expertise about some very small areas of the law, and I know them well, but my knowledge of them is not going to be effective for my students unless I'm able to translate those concepts to a level and a language that they understand as first or second year law students, and that they can engage with those ideas. And if I fail to, even if I know this stuff really well, if I fail to engage or translate at the level of my students, then I'm an ineffective teacher. And with each new year of students, there will be new challenges about their own life experiences, where they are in the world. So it's not like I can just pull out the notes from 10 years ago and read them. I've got to rethink, what does it mean to engage with this group of students with these ideas? Right. And then I say, really all of us are called to this kind of vocation of translation in some part of our lives. And as Christians, we're doing this all the time when we meet other people in the world, when we meet non-Christians, we're called to translate the truth of the gospel in a language, in a fashion that is understandable and approachable, and that requires us to know the people to whom we're speaking.
Yeah, I'm sure that's a challenge, and that, I mean, for us to think about what does that look like to get to know the people that we're talking to, and what is there, if we're talking about, if we're speaking Christianese, is that a language that they understand, or is that something that is going to have different meanings to them? Or if we're talking about, the history of St. Louis, if they're new to town, there's things that they're not going to understand as they deal with the dynamics that are at play here.
Yeah, and like on the Christianese thing, I think Christians are just really bad at this. We need to kind of almost learn how to code switch a bit, and turn off the Christianese when we're outside of church circles, and just ask, what is this language doing to people, and is it inviting them in to be part of who we are, or does it alienate them because it sounds like inside baseball, or it sounds off-putting? And it doesn't mean that we mask truth, but it just means that we think carefully about the words that we use and when and why we say things.
Yeah. Can you give us an example of that, of maybe a situation where you've had to do that kind of code switching?
Yeah, I mean, sure. So, well, one thing I heard long ago from a friend of mine, that for people who speak publicly, just work really hard on being consistent, regardless of what audience you're in front of. So I have that in mind, and I usually try to remind myself, especially in a world where everything's recorded, I should be comfortable, and I should be making the same claims, the same kinds of claims, whether I'm talking to a Christian group or a highly non-Christian group. And I often talk about deep and divisive issues, but to a Christian group, I can deploy the resources of Scripture. I can assume that the people on this call have a common baseline of authority in Scripture and are rooted in a church community that recognizes that authority. And so I can use authority here in a way that I couldn't in a different conversation. It doesn't mean that I switch my arguments, but it means that I describe them somewhat differently.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, as you talk about getting to know the other as we're doing this translating work and that kind of thing, how can we go about seeking to understand the beliefs of those with whom we might disagree? Like, what does that look like to actually start to tease that out, to listen and dialogue well with people?
Yeah, I mean, the best way is through actual friendships, which can be hard because not every one of us is going to be in circles where we can be friends with people who are different from us along every possible metric. But if you can, that goes a long way to disrupting stereotypes and caricatures and norms. So it's just one quick example. When I think of American Muslims, I don't think of some abstract category of American Muslims. I think of my friends who are Muslim Americans, who I've shared meals with and gone on walks with, and I know in kind of a more complex way. And they by themselves are able to position in my head the reminder that there is no category of American Muslim, just like there's no category of Presbyterian or anything like that, there are diverse people who are complex, and that we know people, and then we can dialogue with people about what their belief systems are and how they think. And then as a practical matter, when we don't have those relational circles in our natural networks, and it's, sometimes it's just going to be awkward to say, well, I really need to learn about race in America, so I'm just going to go find some friends of a different race. That's not usually the best way to go about it, but we could start by reading and by learning and by even, sitting under the teachings of Christians, especially of other races and other life experiences, Christians around the globe who have been exegeting Scripture for a long time in ways that we probably haven't paid attention to. I was reminded just recently how the New Testament narrative is written from the perspective of a church that is very much the political minority. They don't have control. They never did. They're operating in a strange land. And so how much richer might be the resources be that come from Christian communities who have similarly been the political minority. Thinking of the Black church in this country and the rich theological resources in the Black church, or underground churches around the globe today that don't have the luxury of worrying about questions of under God and the Pledge of Allegiance, for example, because they're not even allowed to name the name of Christ in public. And how could we as sort of Western Christians in America in 2020 learn from not just the example and the witness, but from the theology of those other Christians who have encountered Scripture and the truths of the gospel in ways that could teach us tremendously.
Yeah. And having that posture of learning and knowing that we need to pay attention to those different voices. I think one question, as I've been reading and thinking about this, I realize that there's a lot of ways in which I don't know that I fully know what I believe on certain topics and on certain matters. I don't feel confident necessarily in my own beliefs on various topics. What does it look like for us to become confident in what we believe, to dig into our own understanding of things, and to hold that confidence with humility?
Yeah, I think, this is such an important question for Christians to wrestle with. And I've really kind of changed in my own thinking on this. When I was a college student, I remember thinking faith just seemed very black and white to me. And I had all of the answers and all of the right answers to every question. And I think I just see faith quite differently today. And it doesn't mean that I am more of a relativist. It doesn't mean that I'm looser in my theological beliefs, but I think it means that I am trying to understand faith as confidence and not certainty. The idea that certainty, it seems to me, is in the end kind of a crutch that avoids the actual consequences of faith. I mean, faith is believing in what we do not see and hoping for what we do not see. Yeah. And that requires something beyond us. It requires something beyond just our cognitive ability to say, this logical argument makes sense to me. So I've been increasingly thinking of faith as confidence in the person of Jesus Christ, which is worth risking, everything on. But it's not, at the end of the day, this certainty. The best book I've seen on this is Lesslie Newbigin's book, Proper Confidence, and the subtitle is Faith, Doubt, and Certainty in Christian Discipleship. And I think this is really kind of an eye-opening way about what it means to hold faith firmly in confidence, but not to rest on this kind of certainty. And then I think to admit the possibility of, or the reality of doubts that we have in life, and that faith is ultimately getting up every day and like any kind of trusted relationship or commitment, saying, I commit again anew, and I'm grateful for God's hand in my life. But it does require this kind of ongoing confidence. And I think, I'd love to see Christians more ready to say, it's okay to ask questions. This is one thing that I think Tim Keller does so well in his context, is just invites questions and invites skepticism, and doesn't respond with a defensive heavy hand, but says, let's talk about it and think through it together. And then the last thing I'll say here is, there will be Christians who come to very different conclusions about very important issues, and they will have to part ways. And we have institutions and churches and denominations that, for very good reasons, draw lines and draw membership and leadership lines. And at some point, you might find yourself outside of one of those lines. And if you do, then it's just as almost a social reality. It's probably good to leave that institution. But I wish that in doing so, Christians would have more grace with one another on either side of those lines. I mean, what happens in many of these arguments is that person who believed just as you did until 5 minutes ago becomes the face of evil, right? And the hardest arguments and the hardest judgments are reserved for those people who believe 95% of what you do, but differ on an important point. And it's not to say that differences don't matter. They do. And I think when people fall on the other side of certain lines from me, I think they're wrong, and that their wrong belief has really important consequences. But I'm still called to love them and be gracious to them, and not shout at them on Twitter and things like that.
Yeah, and I think thinking about confidence and certainty, being the distinction between confidence and certainty, I think gives a lot more room for that kind of continuing in fellowship or in friendship with people whose beliefs differ from ours, because we can still have that confidence in Jesus, as you said, and believe that, and then have the room to ask questions, to grow in our understanding of things, to hold the beliefs that we hold that flow out of that. Right.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think so much of it too is it's directly tied to also the confidence that we have in our own formation and discipleship. And so if we're not actually sufficiently formed, then we actually enter those discussions without confidence, and no wonder that we might just change our views on a whim. Or for example, I think about this a lot as a parent now, that my kids, if they're not formed deeply, they are going to encounter different views that are just going to sway them in different directions. And so a kind of generous confidence by no means signals a lack of commitment to discipleship and commitments and practices of the church, and in fact puts a premium on those. We want to send people out into a world of difference who are formed as disciples and believers, not who are just totally unsure of what they believe or think.
Yeah. I recently had a friend ask me, I think I understand, like, we take for granted that the Bible says that, marriage is a man and a woman, and, but like, I don't actually know where the Bible says that. So, so for her to kind of say like, hey, I realize there's a gap here in my discipleship, or, in what I've learned, and how can I seek to grow in that, to be able to actually engage these other conversations without just saying, well, obviously this is the way it is, because that's kind of the message she was hearing. So I think that, to think about the confidence that we can have, and how if we don't feel confident in that, there is room to seek out that growth and seek out that ongoing formation.
And I think part of that too for Christians is demonstrating and explaining not just the negatives, but the positives of why a different lived ethic makes sense. So years ago, before graduate school, or maybe during graduate school, I was a youth pastor and spent a lot of time with high school kids. And I remember thinking, when I was in high school myself, all of the arguments about not having sex were, you could get an STD, or someone could get pregnant, or there would be deep emotional harm. And by the time I was in a pastoral role with high schoolers, none of those arguments were working, because kids were thinking, I don't believe any of that. And I know lots of people who, so if the don'ts aren't working, then what's the positive case? What does it say to invite someone into a kind of sexual ethic or a view of relationship or marriage that is built around a different way of seeing things? And does the church model that, not just for people who are married, but for everyone else who are part of the church? And does the church offer a view of family that is holistic and encompassing to all people? Or does it default to a kind of very culturally middle-class view of what family is and what proper relationships are? And I think only when we can, with imagination and authenticity and generosity, invite people into a vision that is quite different from the world's, that's the way that people will be compelled to live differently. And otherwise, they're just going to look at you as the people who say don't.
Yeah, absolutely. We want to open it up now for all of you who are joining us. If you would like to submit a question via the chat feature, you can send it to me, and I'll start tossing those over to John. But we've got one already from Jason Ree. Jason, if you want to wave or say hello. Jason asks, how does one balance, on one hand, engaging in the benefits of pluralism, embracing those differences and the things that are good in that, but also distancing ourselves from the different practices of other Christians? So as I think we've all had those moments where we feel like a fellow Christian is not representing us well. How do we say, differences are okay, but also we don't feel good about how that person is representing us as Christians and what that looks like to the world? How do we deal with that?
Yeah, it's a good question. And it's hard to do when the world experiences a version of Christianity from, a lot of maybe bad examples who get a lot of airtime. So I think one response is to remind the people with whom we're speaking that just as we're against stereotypes and caricatures of any kind, you wouldn't want to talk about that people group as being of the same kind. You also wouldn't want to assume Christians are all of the same kind. And so to recognize those differences. But then if you're going to name the difference, then ideally, or maybe necessarily, you and your life and the people around you will be living out a different kind of Christianity for people to see. And rather than just stating those differences, you'll be showing them in your actions and in your words. And then I think a related piece of this, which I haven't fully figured out, and this will sound odd coming from me as someone who's often talking about how to navigate difference as well, but I think within especially American Christianity, or even more particularly white evangelicalism, I think there's a coming and overdue reckoning that needs actually to make some breaks. And it doesn't mean live into cancel culture that puts people as irredeemable, but I think it does mean taking certain people down from platforms, not inviting them to major conferences, not buying their books, and telling them that that ideas and words do have consequences, and the misrepresentations of the gospel, the mistreatment of other Christians and non-Christians they shouldn't cancel you, because we are all saved by grace, and we are all pursued by the gospel, but they should chasten you and maybe remove some responsibility or some exposure or prominence from who you are. And I think it hasn't happened very well. Well, it happens in one direction. So when white evangelicals see people who they think are too progressive or too far to the left, they're pretty quick to take them out. But in the direction of the conservative right of white evangelicalism, there's a much broader sense of, well, we're still friends, or we're he's still one of us, and that sort of bipolarity is not a helpful representation of who Christians are supposed to be to the rest of the world.
Yeah. Y'all can feel free to continue submitting questions through the chat if you'd like, but I'll ask just a follow-up to that. I think, can you talk a little bit about the distinction between tolerance and approval? So you write talk about tolerance as one of the civic practices of confident pluralism. What's the difference between tolerance and approval?
Yeah, so in the arguments that I make in different talks around the country, I usually talk about 3 civic aspirations: humility, patience, and tolerance. And when I get to the word tolerance, especially with Christian groups, that's the word that usually gets people's antennas up. So they, Christians are saying, well, humility and patience make good sense to me, but what is this tolerance? And I think part of the confusion there is that in worlds like mine of higher education, the word tolerance has actually been hijacked, and it has come to mean something like approval. You are only exercising tolerance if you embrace me fully for who I am and for what I believe, and you have to legitimize all of my actions as good and right. Otherwise, you're not tolerating me. And I think that's a false definition of what tolerance is. It's actually philosophically impossible, insofar as every one of us draws limits, and there's no person on earth who would say, I tolerate everybody. We all find some belief systems and some views so abhorrent that we would say we don't actually see those as good. We're not going to approve of those. And so what I suggest by tolerance is doing the hard work of separating people from the ideas that they hold, and saying, can we move toward people, human beings, and at least endure relating to them, not even if we're not going to accept the ideas they hold. And then for Christians, on top of that, we don't get to say only for some people, because we recognize that every person is an image bearer created by God. And so we are called to this sort of tolerance for everyone. And then we're called not just to this low bar of tolerance, but we're called to love, and we're called to love neighbors and enemies and everyone else. So I think Christians can rightly question, well, what is this tolerance, and does it mean approval? And the answer is no. But then the response to what are we called to do is pretty clear from Scripture. We're called to love abundantly and graciously, which is far more than tolerance. And so we should be leading the way with people, even those people we find most offensive, most confusing, most alienated from us, that we're supposed to engage with them in love.
Yeah, that's a tall order, but it is, that is not an easy thing. Well, Dennis McKeon asked, it seems, actually, Dennis, I might ask you to chime in on this one just to clarify. It seems young people ages 18 to 29 are particularly resistant What are the issues you see informing that, and how do you recommend we reach them? Dennis, tell us what you mean by resistant.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we can.
Okay. Well, it's an observation, so I could obviously be wrong, as in any general observation. But it seems that millennials are particularly, find faith in Christianity exclusive and challenging. So I guess I'm curious, because I'm 48 years old. I'm a little outside of that. And I thought it was unique in my age, but it seems even more so now. So I'm just curious, in the 20 years since I was that age, what really has, what do you think in your on college campuses? So like, what do you kind of see?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And I think it's useful for all of us to think about how we really do want to pay attention to generational changes, and particularly how we engage with not just dialogue, but evangelism or apologetics or anything else. And there are generational changes. I think that at least when I was in college in the 90s, the big concern was everything was going toward relativism and there was no truth out there. Today, especially with younger people, it's the exact opposite of that. It's that there are firmly held moral truth claims, and they are in some ways beyond challenge. Some of those line up with the kinds of things that Christians would support, and some of them don't. But the problem is not relativism. It's a new kind of fundamentalism that says, if you don't believe what we believe, you're wrong and your voice shouldn't be heard. So that sets up a very unique context for Christians to be engaging in. And then I think we're somewhat related to this same generation is the sense that people don't just want arguments given to them. There was a kind of old school apologetics in the 90s that thought, if we can just do the logical propositional arguments, we can, set out the rationale for God and people will just walk their way to faith. This was sort of the Josh McDowell way to the case for Christianity and stuff for that. And it's not clear to me how effective that, it worked for some people, it helped, but it's not clear to me how effective that ever was, but it certainly is not the way to go about it today. So people don't want that. They want to know, do you care about me as a person? Are you living consistently with your life? And are you inviting me into something that is also consistent? And I think, part of this is part of what is making probably a younger generation particularly resistant to a Christian witness is the witness of Christians, quite frankly, right? And how Christians have been, particularly in this political season, and identified on issues of politics and race especially. And young people are seeing that. And the data and the polling is suggesting that Gen Z especially, so right below the millennials and younger, they're leaving the church in droves. And interestingly, white Christians are leaving the white church and Black Christians are leaving the Black church. And there's this sense of just being done with all of it because of what they've perceived as the public witness of Christians and of the church. So this is not a small challenge to overcome. And it's actually the amount of work and repair that's necessary in the coming, I'll say decades, not years, is going to take an extraordinary amount of time and effort and the work of the Spirit to lead us. So that was a very long answer to that question, but you got me going on the probing of it.
Yeah. No, that's really helpful. Again, if y'all have questions, feel free to chime in the chat. But John, just to pivot a little bit, we've been talking a lot about much more of an individualistic level of what it looks like for us as individuals, building friendships, building relationships, engaging on that level. But can you give us maybe an example of what it looks like to engage across ideologies, to engage in collective action, like as a church? Are there ways that you've seen that happen where churches have engaged within things in the community or across divides? What does that look like corporately?
Yeah, so I think one thing, and many churches are really good about this, but churches that do the work of of social services and of caring for the least of these. That's really important, and don't stop doing it and keep doing that. But I think one tangible expression is the kind of creative partnerships in that work that recognize we don't have to resolve all doctrinal differences to do the soup kitchen together or to house the homeless, that we could actually partner with people of all faiths or no faiths to do some of that work. And I think a lot of evangelical type Christians want to check the doctrinal boxes before they enter into the partnership. And that's really important if you're merging churches. I think less so if you're opening the soup kitchen. And so are there ways to demonstrate to the world around us that we are willing to partner, even with people who are not completely aligned with what we think. So I'll give you 2 examples here from my own life. One, a lot of my professional work is in the realm of religious freedom and religious liberty, and I sometimes do litigation in that area as well. And the best kind of religious liberty litigation is the kind that says these principles are really important for all faiths, not just for Christians, and that we need to think about these and advocate these for all faiths. And so a couple of years ago, I wrote a brief in a case, and the clients I represented were the Southern Baptist Convention, the Mormons, the Conference of Catholic Bishops, the Hare Krishnas, and I think one other. And when you think about that list of groups, they don't agree about anything. But they all agreed about the importance of religious freedom in this particular case. And they were all able, the leadership of their churches and religious bodies were all able to say, yes, this is important and we believe in it. And I think that's an incredibly important public witness. And then the other example that comes to mind, I'm on the board of InterVarsity Christian Fellowship. And some of you probably know we host, usually in St. Louis, every few years, this Urbana Missions Conference. And in 2015, had a speaker affiliated with Black Lives Matter who spoke. And this blew up into kind of a national news story. And a lot of people were critical of InterVarsity, saying, how could you possibly endorse Black Lives Matter? And it struck me that we were never endorsing Black Lives Matter. What we were doing was signaling very publicly that there were statements about the worth and dignity of Black human beings that InterVarsity also believed in and could say, without saying that we also would endorse every statement on the website of Black Lives Matter. And so I ended up writing an op-ed in the Washington Post that I titled, "Do Black Lives Matter to Evangelicals?" Which the title itself kind of prompted a response, and there was a strong response. But the main point was to say, look, you can find, I sometimes say it this way, you can find common ground even when you don't agree on the common good. And when we can do that as churches and as institutions, and to say, of course we're going to agree on these common ground ideas. Of course we're going to want to operate the soup kitchen or affirm the value of Black lives. And at the same time, we recognize that our fundamental and significant differences mean that we will only be able to go so far in partnership. And I think finding that balance, but being willing to take risks in doing so, and knowing that Jesus also took kinds of risks being around people who weren't like him and being whispered about by the Pharisees, that's probably a good place for us to be.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Thanks. Those are helpful examples. And I remember that Urbana conference very, very well and the things that came out of that. One question we have from Josh Lee. Josh, if you want to wave or give a little shout out. Josh asks, what do Christians do when they don't agree with either political party?
That's a real simple question to answer. Thanks for that one. Thanks for the softball. So I would say, first of all, I hope that every Christian would not agree fully with either political party. I mean, in other words, neither major party in the United States today is in any way aligned with the Christian worldview. And so to have some distance from the platforms of either party seems really important. And I think, if you are, or maybe if you know people or relatives that you might see at Thanksgiving who really believe, but also as Christians, but that their Christian beliefs line up completely with one of the major political parties, I would really press that kind of a claim. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't be involved in party politics. And I have good friends who've been high up in both administrations, Democratic and Republican ones. And I think it's important for Christians to be in those places, but it's also important for Christians to maintain some distance from the claims of the political parties. And I think especially when we think about presidential politics and national politics, it's increasingly difficult to critique and distance yourself from your own side of the political aisle because of the increasing purity demands of both parties. And I think that necessary distance, that prophetic distance from the kinds of policies that are going to be antithetical to the gospel and to what we see as true to human flourishing, and to be able to hold those critiques, even if you choose to engage with one party or the other, seems really important. And if you lose the ability to make those critiques, then it's probably time to get out of whatever you're doing with one of those parties.
Can you used a term I like, prophetic distance? Was that it? Prophetic?
Maybe I just made it up on the spot.
But what do you think in turn, like that idea of being, for someone who's maybe working in government, to have that kind of prophetic engagement? What does that look like?
Yeah, I think it's just essential to surround yourself with friends who will speak truth into your life, especially, if you're in the kind of job or profession where you're playing with fire, then it's really important to have truth-telling friends around you. And by the way, law is one of those professions, right? So anybody who is a lawyer is playing with fire, and hopefully will have people around him or her that it will remind you of the tools that you're using, the ways that they can be abused, the temptations they will have on your soul. And then for each of us, I think there's a process of discernment about how far we can go in that. When I was practicing law, I spent 4 years working at the Pentagon. And early on, it was a fascinating place to work. And I remember one time looking at my boss's boss's boss and thinking, I want your job someday. How do I do that? And I sat down and the guy said to me, in all honesty, if you want a job like this, you need to pick one of the major political parties and give them a lot of money and work on some campaigns and be at the right place at the right time. And if you give your life to party politics, then maybe you'll get one of these jobs. And I just thought, one, it's not worth it to me, but two, I would be way too tempted by that kind of a path to co-opt my own Christian identity in the service of something else. And so that was a clear sign to me that even though some people might be called to that, I wasn't. And I definitely need people in my life now to ask me the hard questions about when and whether I'm getting too comfortable with a particular place in life, whether it's a vocational place or a place of class and wealth or a particular view of church. And I don't think we're ever done with those challenges. So we're going to need those people asking those questions until we die.
Yeah. And that's a good reminder. Something that we've talked about here at Restoration before is what discernment in community looks like, and what having brothers and sisters alongside us, asking those kinds of questions, helping us process through ethical challenges, and, how can we build that kind of trust with each other and that kind of openness with each other. So it's a good reminder, because I think there's a lot of us here who are playing with fire in different ways in our work and in what the Lord has called us to. And we need those people and those kind of friends around us.
And I think for churches, I'm assuming maybe like yours, but a lot of churches around here that have a certain demographic to them, and sometimes that's an educational demographic, sometimes that's a wealth and class demographic, but then it becomes all the more important to not only open ourselves to, but invite the voices of the global church into our discernment and our conversations, because otherwise we're always just going to end up validating our own life choices. The way I functionally live my life, my house is just okay, right? Some of those wealthier people are probably sinning, but my house is okay. Right. And the vacations I take are just right, and the car I drive is okay. And as long as I'm just sort of surrounding myself with people who are doing the exact same thing, it's going to be a bit of an echo chamber. And so are we open to submitting some of our practices and choices to a global witness of the church that looks quite different than ours, and would we be comfortable opening our bank accounts and our calendars to Christians around the globe? I'm not so sure that I would be, but I often wonder if I should be.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think a good challenge for us to consider. Well, we are about at the end of our time. I'm going to toss out one last question, and I know this is maybe too short. Yeah, I'm just going to say it. This was a question from Bruce James, who's here with us tonight. What are ways to reconcile political ideology held by people we know and love deeply, which seems to be in deep conflict with other values they hold?
Yeah, this is a question on a lot of people's minds right now. So let me tell you what not to do. Don't do this at the Thanksgiving table. If it comes up, just turn the conversation to football, because for whatever reason in our society, Thanksgiving has become this loaded cultural moment, and there's already enough pressure with the pandemic and what everyone's feeling and the political season. So take a pass on Thanksgiving, and then set up a time to have probably a series of conversations to talk about it. And then one super practical tip here is you will often need to do the extra work of, especially in today's climate, of finding voices and authorities that will be friendly to the person or family member to whom you're trying to speak. This is because increasingly our own understanding of truth or reality is often colored by what sources we trust and what authorities we consider relevant or truthful. And so you might have come across, the takedown beautiful argument written in the New York Times about why this political issue is confusing faith with politics. But if you're trying to take that to, I don't know, Uncle Fred, and Uncle Fred isn't a big fan of the New York Times, it's just not going to work. You've set yourself up for failure out of the gate. So figure out what is the source of the argument that will be better received by the person to whom you're trying to speak. And then I think I don't pretend to be an expert on this. I have my own struggles with friends and family on this, but can you, in the process of disagreeing, remind yourselves of the shared history, the shared commitments to one another, but anticipate some pain around this too. There's not an easy fix here, and I think for a lot of people it's getting harder. So that should probably call us to pray all the more.
Yeah, and that speaks to that value of patience, and that civic aspiration of patience and being the long game of it, that this is really a long haul. We're not going to change a mind or come to an agreement or, agree to disagree in one conversation. It's going to take some time, which is often not our favorite thing, to give things that kind of time.
Oh, one other thought that came to mind too. Yeah. This is kind of an argumentative technique, but it actually makes a lot of sense in this context, is rather than assuming you need to take down the entirety of the other side's argument or the other person's argument, is there something that you can affirm in what they're saying? Because oftentimes a very entrenched view, especially with other Christians, is not at its core fundamentally entirely devoid of any possible truth, but it's been clouded over by other influences. And that's not always the case, but I think it'll often be the case that you could say, I actually understand why you would think this, or I agree with part of what you're saying here, but here's the response. And that can sometimes come across more invitationally than the knockdown, you're wrong and you're terrible for thinking this.
Yeah. So I love Venn diagrams. So look for the overlap in the Venn diagram of your ideas and what you're talking about, and try to put some highlighting on that. Well, John, thank you for this. This has been really helpful and insightful. And you all, I would encourage you to check out John's books. He's also got lots of really helpful articles that you can find online. I would like, as we're all here, to just take 1 minute, and if you all want to either write in the chat or even unmute yourself and say out loud just one thing that you heard tonight that you're going to keep thinking about. Would love to give you a moment to kind of reflect on what you've heard. So either type it out in the chat or feel free to unmute yourself and say it out loud to everyone here.
Jenilyn.
Yes, Doug.
This is Doug. Yeah, just John, thanks. I thought the point that you just made about finding voices and the authorities that are relevant to that person was a really helpful comment to me.
Thank you.
Judy mentioned tolerance versus acceptance in the workplace. David Noble said playing the long game with patience and trusting in the Lord. Dennis said the challenge of the shift to authenticity. That's a huge shift. Hoping there's some acceptance. To invite, not alienate. Can find common ground even when we don't have agreement for the common good. Vocation of Translation. No one political party holds all Christian values. Yeah, anyone else want to chime in?
You know, as we're closing too, and as I'm looking at these, I can't help but recognize many of the names on this call are Asian names.
Yeah.
I'm also Japanese American, and I do think that one of the hardest questions for our country right now and for American Christianity are these questions of racial justice and racial equity, and they're often framed as black-white questions for good reason. But I mean, for those of you on the call who are Asian Americans, I would just encourage you and encourage myself not to think that you're out of the game or that you don't have anything to say. That I think actually that there is a voice of Asian Americans and Asian American Christians that's pretty important in the current moment. And it doesn't mean we'll know always how to enter into some of these conversations, and some of them we might not be invited into, but it does matter that we be part of those conversations inside and outside of the church. And I've found in my own life that I'm often a voice in otherwise very black and white, literally black and white conversations. And sometimes I'm able to interject a perspective or even a tone or a posture that's quite different than what I'm hearing. So, you know, don't do this imprudently, but I think be willing to take some risks with your own voice in some of these conversations.
Thank you for that. Yeah, well, thank you all for being here tonight. Hopefully this gives you some good food for thought and some good things to continue thinking and talking about. And we'll keep thinking and talking about this together. And we're really glad that we have this kind of common language and things to carry us forward in continuing to engage these things. So John, thank you so much for your time and your generosity tonight. I'm sure we'll be running into you again down the road of life, but thank you for being here, and thank you all for your time this evening.
Thanks so much. It's great to be with all of you.
We did record most of this. I forgot to hit record until a little ways in, but we'll make it available. So if you know anyone who wasn't able to be here tonight and wanted to hear this, you'll be able to share it with them. Thanks, everyone. Good night. We'll see you Wednesday night for our prayer and praise time at 7.